Here's a poem for us today, For Friendship by John O'Donohue. May you be blessed with good friends and learn to be a good friend to yourself, journeying to that place in your soul where there is love, warmth, and feeling. May this change you. May it transfigure what is negative, distant, or cold within your heart. May you be brought into real passion, kindness, and belonging. May you treasure your friends. May you be good to them, be there for them, and receive all the challenges, truth, and light you need. May you never be isolated, but know the embrace of your Anam Cara. One more breath into a circle of friends. Thinking about your circle of friends. And welcome. Welcome, welcome. So today we are going to be talking about sharing these ideas with other people, which is why we begin with friendship, this idea of companionship. Because in many ways, companionship is the most fertile soil for growth, for our growth and for supporting the growth of other people. And so to share an idea is a powerful contributor to that soil. And I thought I'd start by saying that I wrote this book so that we could share it with folks, right? I wrote it actually for friends. I wrote it because there were ideas that I had been playing with and studying for years that seemed to me to be extraordinarily helpful in my life. And they were helping me live on the earth in an easier way. And when I taught them to others, it seemed to help those people too. And so the question was, how would I be able to share those with more people, people that I might not meet, people that I might not reach otherwise? How do I share this thing that I think is really cool and helpful? And thus this book was born, and here we are together thinking about it. And I still have real questions about how to share it in the world, right? These ideas are not that much newer to you than they are to me. It's still quite a new thing for me to be playing with, teaching and talking about and sharing with other people. And you've been part of that experiment together. And so tonight I thought we would start talking about why would we want to share these ideas? What have we done so far to share them? And what would make it a little bit easier to share them? So we're just going to be exploring in that space. This is like a completely emergent time for us. My run sheet for this webinar is about to run out. So like we are about to get to the place where it says, and then we'll have a conversation. So we'll just have whatever conversation there is to be had with us. And on the call, we have a mix of people who are in Cultivating Leadership, my firm, and who have been playing with teaching these ideas, and folks who aren't in Cultivating Leadership. And I don't know whether you've been playing with teaching these ideas or not, but you must be at least a little bit curious about it, because at least one of you got up at like 4:45 in the morning to be able to have this conversation. Others of you are like missing a lunch. So, so here we are, we care in some way about sharing these ideas. And I thought I would talk, I guess I would first the first thing I'd love to hear is, with whom would you most like to share some of these ideas? Like, are you sharing them with clients, with friends, with people on your leadership team, with your kids? Like, who is in your mind when you think about sharing these ideas with others? And you should feel free to either put that in the chat, or there aren't that many of us. So I'd also welcome you to unmute and tell me who you'd like to share these ideas with.
My children were the first ones. And
Why did you want to share the ideas with your children, Jim?
I think because I see them sort of bumping up against things in the busy worlds that they live in. I mean, they're hardly children; they're 32 and 28, so you know they have very busy lives, and I think it was something which would give them a bit more compassion for themselves. Yeah. And then the second thing was this big group of small business people that I've been working with over the last 12 months, and they just don't have access to this kind of stuff. They just, it's easy for corporates to get access to this kind of stuff.
Thank you. Who else would like to tell us who they'd like to share these ideas with? I may have mentioned that this is going to be like a conversational
Hi,
time.
Jennifer.
Beautiful. Was that you, Serge?
I don't know. Yeah, how are you?
I'm really well. How are you?
Good. This was very unexpected, but I was going back to view the video from your previous collaboration, and I saw this email. I was like, perfect. We'll leave the past to the past.
So here we are.
Yeah. And I guess I'd like to start with a question for you, which is, you've been developing these ideas for some time, and cultivating and planting and watering. When you speak about sharing and bringing it out into the world and maybe scaling, what are the outcomes you're seeking?
That's a lovely question.
And what does that look like?
Yeah, dirty pool to turn the question back at me, though.
I think it's necessary to understand that, because then that's true collaboration and co-creation.
So I will absolutely would love to tell you about that. Who are you eager to share these ideas with?
So I'll come back to you on that.
Okay, I'm delighted.
I'm still formulating that, and then I stopped and paused and said, wait, well, you know, I'm more curious right now.
Yeah.
Because I really admire the work you've done and are doing. And so I'm like, I don't know, it's my way of honoring that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very beautiful question. And I really do want to enter into this spirit of co-creation with you guys, right? Like, that's why we're having this kind of experimental set of conversations together, just to figure out how can I support you to help you make the best use of these ideas. So so my answer to your question is that I really think that complexity pushes us, and it pushes us in a variety of ways and in a variety of places in our lives. And right now, this impulse that many people have when they're faced with complexity is to defend and protect, to get smaller, more self-focused, more focused on whoever their group is. And I think that that's a really natural response to complexity. And I think it's not a very helpful response to complexity. So how do we see our natural reflexes? So my question with this book was always, how do we see our natural reflexes and then choose to grow into another place? Because the other thing we could imagine about complexity is that it's the curriculum, like the advanced curriculum, that's going to support us to be the more developed, more connected, smarter, more creative humans that we have inside us. And I really think that in this moment, we can choose which of those possibilities exists for us. And yet it's really hard not to follow the impulses. So I started this book in 2016. And in 2016, my hope was, early in 2016, my hope was that this would bring peace and comfort, and that it would also bring a new possibility for the way we could act together. I love Jim's idea that it would offer us more compassion for ourselves and for other people, and also more possibilities for action. But as the events of the last few years have unfolded, I think it becomes more and more imperative for us to share these ideas, which is where we get to this scaling question, because I don't think it's like a nice to have anymore. I think actually how we think about facing into the complexity and uncertainty of our time is going to have a pretty significant impact on how we do as a species. And some of these ideas, like, I'm not going to say that these ideas are going to save the world, but some of these ideas I think contribute to making the world a better place. And so how can we support each other in sharing some of these ideas, building on them, reaching into new spaces together, and getting the word out so that more people in more places can face themselves with self-compassion and can also use the complexity around them to grow into their biggest possibilities. So that's what I'm on about. And that's why it matters to me for us to be connected and supporting each other, because I actually don't think this is a game you can play by yourself. I think we require community here.
Jennifer, I've started playing with the Mindtraps, and I love them. I absolutely love them. I'm not sure I've thought this through fully, but your first book had lots of theory, and then your next book was more practical, and this one is highly practical. And I find a lot of leaders who are overwhelmed with complexity. And I kind of wonder if there are some simple rules like birds flocking, right? And whether these might be some simple rules that people can access easily. I mean, it's not a simple story. I mean, you can kind of get round up in a circle with that. But I wonder if there's some ways that people can feel they have some agency in the overwhelm that they have. Even asking the questions, like what might be a couple of other stories that would explain that. I used that with a friend who was really struggling. And oh my goodness, she just went, oh, well. I talked about control with some people who are learning to be leaders, and how can we give up control and create conditions? And they all said, oh yeah, that'll be okay. So for me, I think it's really important to help people get something they can hang on to that's not really theoretical, that turns them off because they're going so fast, they just can't grab it. Where's a small way that I can be successful that will encourage me to want to learn more? So that's how I've started to use them, and I love them. Love them.
Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly what I was going for. So it's like incredibly heartening when somebody sees in the project exactly what I was hoping they would see. Like, my first book was meant to offer theory to people so that they could be building ideas and like, here's all the pieces, now we can build together. And what I found is some people love that, and some people are like, I don't have time to build stuff. Could you just like give me stuff? And so my second book was like, here's some theory, but here's some stuff, and now you can like have one or the other. And still people were like, yeah, some people were like, I love that, and other people were like, I don't have time for that. And so this one was what would be the most helpful and life-giving set of ideas I could think to share that I think could make a difference in people's lives, and that have made such a huge difference in my life, and that are also helpfully supported by a series of pieces of research from different fields. So I love your ideas about sharing these. And I saw right in your description, one of the things that makes these sometimes a little tricky to share is that each of these is itself a paradox, right? Like each of the mind traps is a paradox, because if you use it in the right way, it helps you. And if you overuse it, it gets in your way. And so it's not like this is a series of naughty things. Like you should never have a simple story about anything ever again. I taught these ideas once in an organization that really prides itself on its capacity to make the complicated simple and beautiful. And when I said simple stories can get us into trouble, like the organization was like, this is what we do. What are you talking about? This is like the best thing in the world. Having a simple story is the best thing in the world. And so the idea that there are these things that are really helpful in the world, and we have to watch ourselves using them because otherwise they can be really harmful, is itself can be a tricky idea to share. So I guess the thing I'd love for us to do today is to exchange stories about how we've used them. So like Shauna's ideas just then were super helpful. She's used them in these ways. I think that's incredibly helpful. And also, what would help you be more confident to use these ideas more? So that's kind of what I'm trying to gather from us today. Like, what have you done that's really worked, so that we can have this community of practice where people can share, hey, this has really worked for me. And then what do you wish you knew? What do you wish you could practice? What do you wish you could had a story about? Like, what is it that would help you be even more confident to bring these ideas farther into the world? Because if you made time to come here, you must think the ideas are worth going more into the world. So how do we make that happen? So I thought perhaps we would start by like gathering questions. And if you were to just check in with yourself and say, what would it take for me to be a little bit bolder with sharing these ideas with whoever it is I want to share these ideas with? What kind of questions do you have for this lovely group of people who's gathered to think together about these ideas?
I just took myself off mute because I don't know how to raise my hand in this thing. Can I?
I'm delighted. That is exactly how to raise your hand. You just take yourself off mute.
It's actually I have a deck that, so I love this stuff. I feel like it's like Wheaties. I eat it every day for breakfast. I love it. And I'm sharing it with as many people as I can. And I just think they're great. And everyone I've shared it with is like, oh my God. And so I don't know if it'd be helpful or how to do it, but I created a deck kind of leveraging some of your stuff to help walk people through it in a really sort of fun way that's with activities to get them thinking about, like, you know, what are some of the simple stories you tell? And you know, with the certainty thing, I went through your book and just tried to pull things out that I could make exercises with so that people can have an experiential experience. I don't know. So I'm happy to share that. It needs work, so anything people want to add to it, but I tried to put in a little bit of Kinevin, a little bit of the LCP, creative reactive, because I think the polarity piece is what you're talking about, the paradox that, you know, like, so in the leadership circle, it's safety versus purpose and uncertainty, right? So I'm trying to like help people think about it in a lot of different ways. And my process is very messy. So if it's helpful for people, I don't even know where I would share it, but you can take it and see if you want to make it better for the people you're sharing it with. I've had good success. I think it can always get better. And I think the only other thing I would offer is the personal stories is what has made it come alive. Every time I can share a story about, like, here's how it works in my life. Like, you know, when I get stuck with certainty, or when I, you know, my trap of rightness, and then they go, oh yeah, right. And then giving them a chance to talk to each other about, like, what does it look like for you, or in an organization, where are you seeing that we're getting stuck in that, and what do we want to make more space for? So I just wanted to offer that. And if you have a thought, Jennifer, about where I could even share it if people want it, that would be great.
I have so many thoughts right now, Alyssa. Thank you. So the first thing, where could you share it? You could share it on our Facebook page, I think.
Okay.
We have a Mindtraps Facebook page. Joy will give you that information.
Okay.
And I think that holds stuff like this.
Okay.
But I wonder if you'd be willing to share an activity with us, like right now, like maybe
Sure.
one that's worked super well and one that hasn't worked as well as you wish it had worked.
Okay. So let me just walk through. I should pull it up so I'm not doing this out of hat. So one of the things that I pulled from your book was about when you go into a meeting, and it was an activity and it has 3 different responses of how you might respond, right? So you go into a meeting, and what I say is you're going to the leadership team, you've prepared for a month. One of the senior leaders has been out on sabbatical. You guys have done all the research. You've got the project, your team was supposed to deliver this. You're just going back in to sort of share your final results. And this member comes back in and starts asking all these questions. And so then I say, so which response would you have? I don't know if you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about. In her book, it has 3 different responses of, oh, I'm curious and open to what they're going to say. I'm a little bit miffed and like kind of humor the person and say, okay. And then the last one's like, I'm defensive and like, hey, we figured all this out. Are you tracking, Jennifer? Do you, what? Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about anybody? Those of you on the phone, just nod if you, okay.
I know what you're talking about.
So that's the first thing I do. And then they kind of say what they would do. And then I do it the reverse. And I say, okay, so now you're not sure, you're trying to get this right. You really want input. And there's a leader who's been out on vacation, on sabbatical. And you say, hey, we're trying to get this perfect before we go into leadership team. And they'd say the same thing. Now, what do you feel? And I use that around, is it the trap of, I believe it's the trap of certainty or rightness. I forget which one it's under. I don't have my screen. And then I just talk about how you're closed to learning when the conditions are different. And they were like, oh, that's totally exactly how I would feel. And I say, when you think you're right, you're not open anymore. And so that one really lands for them because they've all been there. And then one that doesn't work so well or hasn't worked so well.
That's super helpful. I think that's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that.
It was yours. I just made it into activity.
Yeah, but I didn't make it into an activity. So that's awesome. This is why it takes a couple of us, right? By the time we get everybody sharing, we're going to have the most rocking way to introduce these ideas.
You guys, let me come back. I'm going to pull up right?
No, I think taking all of this work and making it experiential and embodied in the experience is critical.
Yeah, it's really fun. People love this stuff because they can relate to it. You guys, I'm just going to share one more thing and then I'll look at my deck and come back in. So this one guy said something and I just thought it was such a great story, and feel free to share it if it works. He said, I've been married for like a million years. And he said the first 10 years of my relationship with my wife, we used to get in the same fight every like few months. And the fight was about who's doing more work and who's working harder. I think, I can't quite remember. And he's like, and every couple months we'd just get back into the stalemate. And he said, and then about 10 years in, we're having our fight and we kind of looked at each other and we said, wait, what if we're both working as hard as we can and we're both doing as much as we can and we're still coming up short? Is that possible? And he said, once we had that conversation, right, the whole, like our dynamic changed and we never had that fight again. And I was like, oh my God, you just did such a much better job than I could ever do explaining the trap of rightness, right, and certainty. And so I feel like that's the other piece of pulling from the audience their life experience where they can be like, oh, and everyone else was like, I've had that fight, because that's that polarity. So I'm going to look at my deck, but that's all I'm going to share for now. I just love what you're doing, Jennifer. And I think this work is amazing. And I'm trying to remember it every day. Like, how could I be wrong? How could I be wrong? Even when I think I'm totally right. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are super helpful ideas.
So it was interesting when I read your book. I had just been in 2 different experiences with quite different teams. And the one team were very right in what they wanted to achieve. It was all very noble, changing their focus. but very stuck and quite closed in a single story of what they needed to do things. And then literally the next day I had an experience with a team that was quite young, but very open, very curious, really having a learning growth mindset. And so what struck me was how useful this framework is for people to use to become more aware of what the dynamics are in their teams and their organizations. So that for me was so useful. And immediately I sort of wrote an article to share about how do we see these two tales and how can we use these questions as a way of understanding what the team dynamics are. So it's how to take these questions beyond an individual purpose to reflect on an organization, on a team, a leadership team. So my question and curiosity is, how do we help? So I might be an individual growing my awareness, but I'm in a team that might be quite stuck, even though they think they're open, are actually quite closed, and these questions highlight that for them. But how do we help those individuals that are in a context that's more stuck, even toxic, less self-aware? And so I'm curious about how do you develop more tools and questions to support those people that are growing their awareness and becoming more aware of their context that actually might be quite stifling and challenging. So it's how to help leadership teams use this as a mirror for their organizations and themselves, particularly when they're stuck.
Yeah,
So
super
I found
question,
that
Sarah.
useful. I found that really a useful reflection framework. So beyond the individual and the organization.
Super question. I wonder if anybody here has used this in that way. Anybody use these ideas or adjacent ideas in a way that that helps teams see themselves and helps individuals deal in a different way with their context?
I do.
Thanks,
Hi.
Minna.
Hello, nice to be here. I have been like fascinated recently, like with this kind of like thought of simplicity on the other side of complexity, and I'm kind of like I've been really impressed with these thoughts that you've shared, and you know I participated in the recent Art of Developmental Coaching course. So I've had the privilege of having, you know, listening to your lectures and then reading your books and all that. And what I developed to share with the retail team, it was a retail leadership team in a telecompany, like one of the biggest in Finland where I live. I just made a very simple set of cards to that very competitive environment. And I wrote in those cards descriptions of certain words, which I was thinking that they were qualities, or they were kind of like ways of looking at things that they were lacking in that competitive context. And they were simple words like compassion, curiosity, openness, perspectives, dialogue, inner compass, trust, shared understanding, both and, instead of like the polarity, I put both and then conscious presence. That was like a bonus card in this set of discussion cards. And I made those cards into a set of cards for the team, and I printed each one of them a set of cards with the description of like what does this mean. And then we had a discussion, you know, just a general discussion about these cards and these themes with the group. And then I put them in small groups of maybe 3-4 people in each group, and they were to have a reflection time for themselves about which of these cards would be relevant to them in their situation, in their context, which are those that they are. Which are those cards that they are most familiar with, and is there something that is lacking from their own practice and way of looking at the world, and what would be helpful in their context. And it was so interesting. We had a very interesting discussions, for example, around compassion. And there was like the leadership team leader was very skeptical about this, like what's going to happen if we start acting compassionately in this context, because it was such a competitive environment.
So cool, Minna. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love the idea that you're noticing words that are missing in their worlds, and then offering them the tangible set of those words and just talking about what it would be to have more of that. I just love that. That's a very elegant approach. Have you seen them change?
I have seen some of them after that exercise, and after that, and it has had a very, very positive. It was part of a workshop where we did polarity management exercises also, and and I also shared the kind of like leadership traps in that workshop. So kind of like I found all of this as a combination, it's been very helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, I'm hopeful that people are becoming more aware of things, and even introducing these concepts in there, with the cards. I am hopeful that this is helpful for people, and particularly I kind of like, I don't know, I was thinking that this is one way to develop your thinking, like, because all of these words they have, and they have such meaning if you start looking at, if you start applying curiosity into each situation, because at that stage, in that kind of a context, people are often so result oriented that they don't have time to be curious about things, and they are so for example, one of the things that somebody said to me afterwards was that, I noticed, I was thinking, reflecting upon our practices in our leadership group, and I have been I used to think that we are very effective if we make a decision on the spot, but now I realize that maybe we should let things rest and make decisions afterwards, so that we will have time to think about things, and that we don't force decisions before the time is right for them. And through this, and the presence thing, that kind of like created a lot of discussion in the group, and people were reflecting upon their own behavior in meetings when they're not present, when they're fiddling with their gadgets and all of that, and then kind of like, how is that going to be going to have an impact? Why would that have an impact on their effectiveness as leaders? Very
Thank
simple,
you.
but
Yeah, simple and yet transformative. That's what we're going for, right? Like simple and transformative. Thank you.
Jennifer? Hi. I have been playing with, for specifically the trap of agreement, a kinesthetic experience that's really simple, using the Chinese finger toy, where two people put their fingers in the toy, right? And the way, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but if
the one that if you pull hard, then you're stuck in it, but if you push, then you can get out.
Yeah, but both have to with the same amount of energy. So if one person stops pulling, you're both stuck. It's not enough just to have one person say, I surrender, I agree. It's this very delicate, nuanced experience, and you can feel it. Like, we both have to let go at some kind of similar energy level. And to feel what that feels like, to be able to look at someone and have the communications, it's not just the words, it's the experience, has been pretty powerful. I'm looking also to try and figure out how to integrate music and art into this very elegant model that you've designed. Because I work with clients who are quirky, brilliant types, who don't see the world quite the same way. They love, this language is very interesting and curious to them. And in particular, musicians, they understand these concepts very kind of viscerally, and they can communicate them in music. And I'm thinking about how one would do some kind of transfer, how to have that shared collective experience of, this is something we completely don't understand together.
Very cool. I love that question. And I love the embodied nature of your question, as well as this, the other modalities. How do we hold on to these other modalities? I'm wondering, it sounds like there are so many good ideas here amongst us. I wonder if we might slip into breakout rooms for a few minutes and just see if we can get more ideas, particularly about, let's see whether there are another question or two that people would like to raise for the collective to to hold in breakout rooms. But the questions I'm hearing emerge so far are the questions that on the one hand are about scale. How do we help this work? How do we help people deal with the context they're in so that as individuals change, they can also change their context? And the other one is about, like, at the individual unit, how do we help embody some of these ideas so that they can be in them in a different way, in their bodies, music, art, experience, all these other ways, these other modalities of learning. How do we do that? Are there other questions that you'd love the group to chew on as we go into small groups and chew together?
So I'd like to broaden our perspective on what you're trying to cultivate, Jennifer, from the idea. Imagine this, that the coaching and all of our sense making and thinking that we have been doing for, let's say, the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years. Some of you are way more advanced than I am as a coach. What has been successful for your clients in your coaching approach today will not get us where we need to go and solve the problems that you, Jennifer, are talking about moving forward. And I guess the question is, can we leverage this work in order to catapult new sense making in what it is to coach?
Great question.
I suppose I always remember years ago, Jennifer, you said, I suppose a little bit, Sergey, a response is, this is really tough stuff. This is really hard. And it is in itself quite complex. So people struggle to get their hands around it or to gain some kind of idea about where we're going with it. And I'm still learning after 4 or 5, 6 years since I started engaging in this. And I just wanted to share a little example of how I've used it with my colleagues. I'm in education, and I was tutoring is a Māori word for mucking around with this notion of rightness with deans. Deans are people that look after young people, adolescents, and guide them through when they make great decisions, when they don't make great decisions, and just trying to get them to understand that perspective really matters, especially when it's a young person grappling with getting life right, and I found the notion of rightness really effective. But my question is it's almost like I've been working on this bank of kind of questions, things, because it's not about telling, it's just about exploring this notion of rightness, how we can gather together really effective questions that nudge people to see that. And so maybe that's a wondering for me about how we can co-construct questions that nudge. Yeah, thank you.
Very cool. Very cool. I saw somebody else come off of mute, which often means they want to say a thing.
I came off of mute a little while ago. Yeah, hi. I think it kind of came up right after Serge talking about this notion of embodying these principles, and I'm really curious because I take people out to horses to effectively learn quote unquote leadership competencies, or really see who they are in reflection to another being that shows them how they're showing up somatically throughout. And so this whole notion of like the language or the idea of rightness, how does that show up? How does a horse perceive that? And if they're perceiving it one way, does that give us insights to when it feels like we're being right? So we can almost trigger ourselves somatically when we go into that rightness place, right? Or I need to be right, or I need agreement. I need you, this horse, to do something for me right now in the moment. And I already facilitate these awarenesses, but my curiosity for now that we're having this conversation is, how do I take these concepts that you have and have so simply drawn out of things like the TLC profile? I just love that. It's just so easy to coach to that in, you know, when you're doing a TLC profile and that kind of stuff. So for me, it's like, how do I overlay this with my work with the horses, and then also in my somatic coaching work, and really integrate it, because I think it would be really fascinating to see and play around with that. So I'm playing around with Patty Beach in Colorado on versatility, the polarity of masculine and feminine this summer, and with the horses. So I'm really interested in seeing how these notions play out, such that we can more fully effectively embody what's happening when, you know, when we get into these mind traps. It would be really, I'll have to just keep my eyes peeled and watch what happens for myself, and then also with my clients when I'm out there. So thank you for giving me some really new ideas to, not new ideas, but new ways of leveraging the work that I do, that I find is pretty powerful in and of itself. So
I love this question about how does a horse sense that we're trapped by rightness. That is like a whole new embodiment question. So I think I hear in the variety of your questions these musings about how do we help embody these ideas, how do we help experience them, how do we help other people do that, but also this this question about how can it change the paradigm in which we're all working? Like, in what way are we opening up to a new set of possibilities and opening our clients, our teams, our kids up to a new set of possibilities that they haven't seen before, a new paradigm for their action? I think that's a good place for us to take into small groups and see if we can get some more conversation running there. So I would say pick a scale in your small group. And you don't want to spend the whole time talking about at what scale should we talk. But I think the scales that we're talking about are, how do you embody, like in a one-on-one way, what's a way that you could embody these things? Then there's the experiential question. How do we, with groups, help other people experience these ideas? And then there's kind of the paradigm question that Serge calls us to, which is how do we use ideas like this and the complexity of the world to create a new field of practice for us, those of us who help support leaders in the world. And what the question I hear in there is also, what would we have to give up in order to be entering into that new space? So I'd say just pick a level, a domain, and kick that around for like 6 or 7 minutes, share practices with each other, and then we'll come back with the wealth of those small groups. We'll come back together and see what we can co-create together. Let's talk about what came up in our little groups that we'd like to kind of seed into this group's conversation, knowing that we're not going to come up with answers tonight, but that we are going to help each other ask questions that push us a little farther into our practice and into our courage to take these ideas farther into the world. So what came up in your group?
We had a question around how you apply these ideas at scale, you know, to the really big problems or the really big issues, maybe even beyond whole of corporation, but maybe at societal level or political level, economic level.
In our group, we talked about how the working with mind traps is, when you companion it with other methodologies, whether it's the leadership circle as a primary feedback mechanism, and then use mind traps to kind of give people handholds to recognize when they're stuck in their own reactivity, or use liberating structures as a way of helping people get more perspective on the trap that they realize they're in but don't know how to get out of, and how liberating structures opens up the conversation in ways that perhaps can help people get on the balcony better. We also talked about the difficulty of working in a situation where people are perhaps so traumatized or in a sense enervated by whatever the situation is that they can't get objective enough to really figure out how to even wrestle with a question like, what's my mind trap? And we didn't have a lot of answers for some of that. And
Bruce, did you want to say a thing? You've come off of mute.
Yeah, I was just going to comment as well. I was in the same group, and yes, we talked not only about combining and particularly applying methodologies that we hope and our experience tells us help people break out of those entrenched habits that are part of the trap dynamic. And at the same time, we also talked about fear as a big obstacle and barrier, that lots of times people, you know, when you really get down to it, they know they're trapped, and they're not always ignorant or unaware of it. Many times I find that they are aware. And how then can we use questions, inquiry, experience? I know for me, people I know, they don't want to take that first step alone. How can I support them? How can I help them to feel that I am with them as they walk away from that state of being trapped or stuck or afraid towards facing the ambiguity and uncertainty of complexity?
Beautiful, thank you. We talked in my group about safety, about how do we create these safe spaces, and how do we create spaces, taking on Serge's question, how do we create safe spaces that push our own edges, that allow us as coaches, as supporters for others, that allow us to get some distance on our practice, not just allow us to get distance on the practice of our clients, but get distance on our own practice and take that into the world in an unknown way, but still feeling the safeness of experimentation and growing.
So we started talking about artists, and particularly around music, and a sense of the trap of control and the trap of too much agreement actually gets really boring, and maybe that might be routes through which we can take people through a path that allows them to experience what it is like to be not in control, but in influence. And wondering, and this is mine rather than the conversation, but when people go, they tend to go, losing control means anything goes. And in fact, that's not true. There are still boundaries, there are still edges, there are still patterns, but you can work with that. And maybe, I'm just thinking things like drumming might be a really simple way for people with no musical ability to get into that space and start to explore how they might work together in different ways while losing control, but not losing everything.
I love that idea of creating safety by letting people lose control, but not lose everything. I think that's the thing that you've awakened for me, Tony, in that is this question about how do we help people walk safely enough out of their traps, understanding the things that really matter, that hold them well. How do we let them keep those things and then poke a little farther out into new possibilities?
I think artists are actually a guiding light for this work, because they step into the most inner essence. And Lisa, I'd love to hear more about your work offline, but they step into the inner essence, and if they are surrounded by bandmates that bring out the best in them, they're going all out on their edge. And that's why when we go to a live performance of a master, it's like the vibration, the energy, the emotion is just spewing out. They like reach a level of flow that is an outcome of all this work. That's, I mean, I think. They practice it if they're a healthy band, if they're a healthy group.
I just wanted to add to that, and we talked about it with Tony and Margaret, is one place to look is at jazz and improvisation. Because on one level, it looks like, oh, that's just a bunch of noise. I don't understand what's going on. But there's an incredible amount of complexity in how the musicians communicate with each other and trading fours, how they do this kind of communication that's nonverbal. And I think as coaches, many of us, we get into this very verbal space. So the experience of jazz, and one of the books that had an impact on me in kind of thinking this through was reading an interview with Keith Jarrett, who said that a book called Free Play by Stephen Nakamovich really inspired him to kind of open and expand his thinking about what was happening in the music experience. And there's an element of play in here that is also lost on us. And there's this interesting space between riffing and the boundaries of the canon. The canon is not lost at jazz.
Which brings us to Tony's point about these boundaries. We still stay inside boundaries that help guide us and hold us. I think that you've brought up, in addition to music, I think you've brought up this other thing that I wonder how we can get more into our work, which is just this idea of play. You know, we take our business very seriously, you know, and I can feel it in myself. I can sometimes get really caught up in the peril, I think, that we're in collectively right now. And I somehow paradoxically, I feel like unless we lighten up a little bit and play a little bit more, we're going to be not in a creative enough space to be able to escape the peril that we're in. And so there's something about how do we open up the possibility of play to help us explore and continue to push against these mind traps that themselves are very serious.
Something that I'm not hearing is the question, what are the fears behind the mind traps? And I think that play is a way of not necessarily addressing them, but relieving them.
Yeah, it's lovely, Phil. Yeah, and what is it? And how can we combine that question, Tony's question about boundaries, Lisa's question about, you know, the riffing and the canon? How do we combine all of those pieces together to create these safe spaces for us and for others to explore our fears, push against them, understand that we can still have those fears and that they will, that we can play on the edges of them and become a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger as we go. What would help you? What would help you know enough, or what would encourage you, breathe courage into you in this moment to take these ideas into the world in some different way? What's the missing piece that would help you push against your practice just a little bit to do something a little bit braver, to try a new thing? What would that be?
There are a couple of things that seem to have come up from my...
Go, Marco, but go louder.
Okay, I'll say a couple of things that have come up from my circle. Can you guys hear me well? There was one about, Sue was sharing this thing about, I'm a framework person. And so if I can fit it into other framework, if I can have like a cheat sheet, maybe that's not the words that you use, but if I can remember them like at the top of my fingertips, like how can I remember them? And there was also something else that was shared in our group about trying it without even trying it, in the sense that it was in the back of her mind, one of us in her coaching, And she used that to be more spacious in her own kind of coaching. And she used a few questions without even being completely aware that she was using it. So it was a part of integrating it into a current practice that was already going on. So I'll just share these two for now that seem to come to the fore in our group.
Marcos, being way too modest, he had a wonderful suggestion about in a group having people take turns as a way of broadening the base and getting a wider discussion going. Something very simple.
Yeah, I love that idea of simple practices, Phil. I think that's also really helpful. What are the simple little moves that we could make? Yeah, very cool. What else? Go, Bruce.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you. So one of the things that was a turning point for me, so many times over the last 20 plus years, I've asked those hard questions of leaders and people trying to deal with change, and they resent it, or you know, eventually you find yourself sort of pushed off to the margin or excluded. But the turning point for me for courage in it was reading Brene Brown's book a couple of years ago now, Braving the Wilderness. And that to me was pivotal, just pivotal. You know, the idea that we think we're afraid as change agents to ask those hard questions because we may be cast out into that quote unquote wilderness. And the key insight for me was we're really not alone out there. We're going to find people like ourselves, and we will find community, and we will find a way forward. And that simply was transformative for me, literally in these last days and last couple of years in the work that I do and how I approach taking those steps forward.
This idea that in community, finding our own community can help hold us to be at the edge of our capacity, can help us reinvent ourselves, can help us be more creative. Gorgeous.
Can I ask a question? I was curious. I saw so much in the chat box about liberating structures that people were commenting about. So does anybody want to share something they feel could be like a very easy kind of next move to try out?
We could share a favorite liberating structure in this space.
I mean, let's tap into, I think what you, so I'm guilty. I have the book. I haven't read the book, but I've been following you, Jennifer, for a while through multiple engagements. And I think there was a time where you said, there's a longer term practice and to really break through these mind traps, as opposed to these singular experiential pieces. And what I took away from that was, it's almost like you literally have to step into, and I'm going to use a word that has changed in its significance for a lot of communities, but yoga. Yoga actually embodies the resolution of identifying, quieting down the ego in order to realize these mind traps and to walk the fine line between that they exist, they don't, we just need, we can leverage them, but we have more. There's something else on the other side.
Yeah, this question about how do we notice, how do we see ourselves, what gives us a kind of reflection, right? Like, as I was looking for these practices, which you are gonna find in chapter 7 of the book when you read it, as I was looking for these practices that kind of cut across these individual mind traps, I had like a wall full of the practices that people have been trying and recommending, and mystical practices and spiritual practices, developmental practices, like the whole thing. And I was trying to figure out what's the connection between them. And it's noticing, like how can we be more connected to what's going on right now? How do we be more connected, more accepting of that? And in the fundamental paradox of growth, as we notice who we are right now and we accept who we are being right now, there's a way that opens up the person that we could be next, opens up that space of emergence. But if we're not in this moment, and there's so much that is so noisy that keeps us out of this moment, if we're not in this moment, it's much harder for us to like reach out into what could be next, because the seeds of what could be next are already in us now. And so we have to pay attention to what those seeds are today so that we can cultivate them for next. So I see our time is getting a little bit short. We didn't pick up so much on Marco's liberating structures question, except in the chat. Liberating structures love staying in the chat, as it turns out. Liberating structures, if you get nothing else from this webinar, just download the app. Like that's enough. Like just download the app. It's just, there's no harm, no foul in downloading the app. It's just awesome. And the whole way that community works is also so extraordinary. I've seen in my quick perusing of the chat that there are some of you inside that community here on this call. It's just an unbelievable community that's trying to make good things happen in the world in all kinds of interesting and robust ways. So it is just the sort of space that Bruce talks about, Brené, opening us into this space of others who will help us and hold us and help us be on our edge. Can I have like one or two closing thoughts from people who haven't said anything yet today, who'd like to get their voices into our circle before I close our time together? Who hasn't said a thing, who feels in some way drawn to contribute to the circle we've made?
This is Barbara. One thing I noticed maybe missing was the concept of trust. And you guys work with leaders. I work only in the middle of organizations, and since 2008, one of the things I really see is a lack of trauma created by lack of trust in leadership. And when we said, oh, we'll just play games and we'll play, and I thought, oh yeah, like we're the mice and the cat's going to come and play with us. I could just hear my folks saying exactly that. I mean, it just immediately popped up. So somehow, the current structures of what's happening in a lot of organizations has really eroded trust in leaders. And as you do these kind of things, one of the things that you really need to keep in mind is we're not going to believe a word of it, right? And so that, and we're not right, we're simply traumatized, right? As we sit in the middle and get batted around like the mice in front of the cat. So I don't know where to go with that. I've had a dilly of a time trying to even deal with it. Folks just are so caught in their trauma that nothing seems to change their perspective.
Barbara, that's so helpful to think about trust and to also think about trauma, and to think about the eroding of our faith in those who lead us around the world. What does it mean to not have faith, and how could we restore some of that faith? You also point to, as you so often do, you point to these questions of power, and how does our community deal with questions of power and hierarchy, and how do we make those safe to talk about, and what are the mind traps around power? Somebody else has asked a question about, like, are the mind traps a Western thing? Are they a Western elite thing, or are they more commonly spread around the world? I think that's for us to take on together as we explore these into the future. Is there one more voice that wants to be heard in our circle?
Just as Barbara was talking, it made me wonder about, as the world gets more complex, it was making me think of Oshri, where you think that the leaders have more control than they have. And so maybe this idea of control is something that needs to filter down, not just from the leaders, so that we understand that it's not just leaders that don't have control. They actually don't. We expect them to and they don't have it, but nobody does. And so maybe some of that trust erosion is the entire system wanting control, and yet the more complex it gets, the more stuff's happening, the less control any of us have. And so I wonder if that's something, Barbara, as you were speaking, I just thought, you know what, the less control we have, the more we expect our leaders to fix this, the more we give them in terms of just make it happen. And so I'm wondering if that one has a real benefit to a whole system-wide shift in regaining that trust, because there is no control, and therefore we can't really expect them to do more. And so maybe that's just what came to me as you were speaking about it.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. This, it is one of the ways we could look at the ways complexity robs us of some of the handholds we've had in the past, like a leader who knows what's going on and can make things happen. You know, the complexity of the world around us means that we no longer can rely on some things that we've relied on before. There are new things to rely on, but we often don't have the sort of felt experience. We don't have in our tissues what it means to lean into the patterns, into emergence, and to lean into trust and interconnectivity, and to lean into the dynamics of the system. We just don't, that's not an automatic thing for most humans to do. And so I want to say again, thank you for constructing these ideas with me, for playing with them, for exploring them, for building community around them. This is our last of these times together that, like, this is the last party we're throwing in this way, in this moment. But there are plenty of ways for us to stay connected and to figure out together. On the Facebook page, I know some people don't use Facebook, we'll find another way. Like, I think one of the things that we can model is trying to be a community that uses these principles as a community. It's one of the things we try to model in our organization, in our community of practice, the Growth Edge Network. For those of you who don't know about the Growth Edge Network, it's a great thing to just Google and explore. And in the many other sorts of networks and communities that you're in, I think the thing that we can totally agree on is that if we're going to support leaders and communities and organizations and families to live well in complexity, we need to be our biggest selves doing that work. And to be our biggest selves doing that work, we need safe places to grow and to change, and communities in which to get the encouragement to breathe courage into ourselves and one another for this task ahead. So I want to say thank you so much for playing with us and exploring these ideas together. Let's stay connected, stay in touch, and keep experimenting. Thanks, everybody.